On a cold November night, Emily waited at the platform for the last train home. She was the only person there, the silence broken only by the distant howl of the wind. The schedule displayed an odd message: train arriving, 23:47. The time was already 23:50, but there was no train in sight. The fog thickened as a faint light appeared in the distance. Slowly, an old, rickety train pulled into the station. The carriages were ancient, the paint peeling, and the windows fogged over. Emily hesitated but decided to board after all. It was her only way home. Inside, the train was eerily quiet. The seats were covered in dust, and the dim lights flickered above. She found a seat near the window and noticed that the other passengers seemed oddly dressed, like something out of a bygone era. Their clothes were tattered, and their faces were pale, almost ghostly. The train lurched forward, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The passengers stared ahead, unblinking, not saying a word. Emily tried to ignore the unease growing within her, but the silence was suffocating. As the train passed through a tunnel, everything went pitch black. The lights flickered out, and Emily felt the air grow colder. When the train emerged on the other side, the passengers were gone. Panicked, she searched the carriages, but there was no sign of anyone. She was completely alone. The train stopped at a station she didn't recognize. The sign read Cemetery Gate. She looked out the window and saw gravestones scattered across the landscape. The doors slid open with a groan, and she felt an overwhelming urge to leave. She ran out, only to find herself surrounded by fog and silence. When she turned back, the train had vanished. Emily wandered through the cemetery, desperate to find her way out. But the more she walked, the more lost she became. Finally, she stumbled upon a grave with her own name on it, the date inscribed matching that night as. The last thing she heard was the distant sound of a train whistle before everything went dark. Jake was an avid urban explorer, always looking for abandoned places to investigate. When he heard about an old, disused train tunnel on the outskirts of town, he couldn't resist checking it out. The tunnel was rumored to be haunted, with stories of ghostly figures and eerie sounds echoing in the night. One evening, armed with only a flashlight, Jake ventured into the tunnel. The air inside was damp and cold, and his footsteps echoed ominously against the tunnel walls. As he ventured deeper, he noticed something strange: rail tracks that looked as if they had been recently used, though no trains had run through here for decades. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble, and Jake heard the unmistakable sound of a train approaching. Panic set in, and he pressed himself against the tunnel wall, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Out of the blackness, an old steam locomotive emerged, its engine roaring and wheels screeching. Jake was paralyzed with fear as the train hurtled past him, but something was off. The train was semi-transparent, like a ghostly apparition. He could see the silhouettes of passengers inside, their faces expressionless as they stared out at him. As the train slowed, Jake saw the conductor, a tall, gaunt figure in an old-fashioned uniform. The conductor's eyes locked onto Jake's, and he smiled, a cold, sinister grin. He lifted his hand and tipped his hat before the train disappeared into the darkness. Jake was left alone, heart pounding, but he knew he couldn't turn back. He continued deeper into the tunnel, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. After what felt like hours, he reached the end of the tunnel, where the tracks simply vanished into the ground. Before he could process this, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. Jake spun around and came face to face with the conductor, his eyes now glowing with a malevolent light. "All aboard," the conductor whispered, his voice echoing through the tunnel. Jake screamed as the tunnel around him dissolved into darkness. When he awoke, he was lying on the old tracks outside the tunnel, his flashlight broken beside him. The entrance to the tunnel was sealed, as if it had never been open. But in his pocket, he found a ticket one way, with today's date stamped on it. Tom was a night shift worker, used to catching the late train back home. He knew the schedule by heart, and the 12:15 m train was always on time. One night, after a particularly exhausting shift, Tom boarded the train and found it unusually empty. Normally, there were at least a few other night owls like him, but tonight he was alone. He settled into his usual seat and stared out the window, the darkness of the night making it hard to see anything. As the train started moving, he noticed something peculiar, a figure standing on the platform as the train pulled away. The person was wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, obscuring their face. Tom shrugged it off and tried to get some rest, but as the train stopped at the next station, the figure was there again, standing perfectly still. Tom blinked, wondering if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. The train moved on, but at each subsequent stop, the figure appeared again, always standing on the platform, always watching. By the time the train reached the halfway point of his journey, Tom was unnerved. He decided to switch cars, hoping to shake the unsettling feeling. As he walked through the empty carriages, he realized how silent the train had become. There were no sounds of machinery, no hum of electricity, just an oppressive silence. He entered the next car and froze. The figure was there, seated in one of the rows, facing the window. Tom couldn't see their face, but he felt their eyes on him. Summoning his courage, he approached the figure. "Excuse me, are you all right?" he asked, his voice shaky. The figure slowly turned towards him, revealing a pale, gaunt face. Their eyes were hollow, and their lips twisted into a crooked smile. "You shouldn't have boarded this train," the figure whispered, the voice chillingly cold. Before Tom could react, the lights in the car flickered and went out. When they came back on, the figure had vanished. Panicked, Tom ran through the train, searching for anyone else, but every car was empty. He felt trapped, like the train was leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. Finally, the train screeched to a halt at an unfamiliar station. The doors opened, revealing nothing but a dense fog outside. Tom hesitated, but a voice inside his head urged him to leave the train. He stepped out, and the doors slammed shut behind him. As the train pulled away, Tom realized that he wasn't at a station at all. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast, black void. The train vanished into the distance, and Tom was left alone in the darkness, the figure's words echoing in his mind. From that night on, Tom was never seen again. The 12:15 m train continued its route, but passengers would occasionally report seeing a man standing on the platforms